Yeah. So yeah, you get these country counters, which I think is, I feel kind of sad for them. So I wrote a book recently, and I was trying to, if anything, I'm trying to get the country counters to sort of redirect and not do their country counting thing, because you meet some people
Oh,
that
I
are.
didn't realize you wrote a book. What? Tell me about your book.
Oh, so I wrote a book over the past few years, and I just finished the publicity for it. So I did 23 years of travel, and then the past 5 years I've been traveling more slowly, and it gave me time to write. And I just finished I did maybe 3 months, 2 or 3 months of publicity. So I went around and did various, TV interviews and stuff like that. And it was kind of interesting, new
Oh,
experience for me.
okay. Okay, when you told me before about a little bit about your interviews with people, I thought that I assumed that that was because you had this label of the world's most traveled man. I didn't realize that it was because you wrote a book, of course.
Oh, so 3 times I did interviews. So once when I was the first person to visit Somalia as a tourist. And that was interesting enough that it went viral over the internet. So I had I had a situation a few times where like your Facebook kind of goes crazy. Like Facebook used to be the thing, so everyone was on Facebook, and like it would go crazy and have 20,000, 30,000 friend requests, and like tens of thousands of messages coming in. And when that happens, the whole thing kind of shuts down. And I don't think the system back in, what was it, 2012 or something when it first happened, I don't think the system could handle it very well because it starts blinking red and nothing works. So I ended up having to master delete a lot of things and trying to restart my Facebook account. But I went viral over the internet because I had talked to some reporters who I'd met in Mogadishu when I came in to do Somalia as a tourist. And they thought it was kind of interesting that someone would arrive as a tourist because the place was like an armored camp at the time, and even the airport was like a fortress. There was actually no way in or out of the airport. When enough people wanted to leave, a forklift would remove some of the fortifications, and then you'd have to go out in a convoy of armored cars.
Holy shit.
Yeah, and they had like tank shells whistling overhead and constant sniper fire.
Holy shit. So
Yeah.
what the fuck made you want to go there, man?
Well, I would go, so I like to challenge myself a bit, and I was getting pretty good as a backpacker, and I thought I had the skills to do it. And it turned out I did. I mean, I had a fun time there. And I went and did what was supposed to be the land of pirates afterward, so like Puntland. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's like Puntland state of Somalia. It's a little part like,
Oh, that's like the Somali pirates that you hear about in the news?
yeah, so everyone was saying you can't go to Puntland. And I said, well, I'm just going to go there, and probably I'll just hang around the capital and talk to some of the people in charge. And even Somalis were telling me the people in charge are the pirates. You'll be immediately captured, right? And it turned out I was captured, but they weren't pirates. So there was like the Minister of the Interior was coming to my detention cell and like yelling at me and stuff like that, saying things would go very badly for you if you're not a
So
journalist.
captured then.
Oh, it's just like so I was flying in on a small plane, and I landed in Garawa, which at that time their airport was just like an area where a bulldozer had made some like slightly flatter area of sand. And I was talking to this guy named Duday. His last name was Duday, and he had told me he'd help me when we arrived. And the arrival place was just two empty oil drums with a piece of wood on top that was flat, so people could put documents there. And there's just a bunch of guys with AKs, and they started talking in Somali and pointing their guns at me. But this Mr. Duday guy, he'd been on the same like small little propeller plane with me, tried to explain something in Somali to them. And finally, they just took me off in a technical, and they put me in detention behind this barbed wire covered wall. So I thought, okay, so far so good, right? I hadn't been captured by pirates. So then I sort of, worked just talking to people and trying to be friendly, and eventually I ended up meeting the president and going to the Puntland Festival. So it worked out pretty
Oh,
well.
wow.
Yeah, and there was an American guy in the cell next to me, and he said, "Oh, there's someone else. Finally, I have someone to talk to. I've been here for weeks. I've been detained, right?" And then he started to talk to me, and he said, "Oh no, you're that crazy Canadian guy who keeps getting into trouble around the world." And I go, "Yeah, that's me." And he says, "No, no, don't talk to me. Don't say you saw me." Like he went and he kept away from me, right? Because he thought that I would spoil his chance of getting out of the cell. And it was quite funny because I managed to talk my way out and into like being a guest of the government within a couple days of being put in. Whereas for him, for the whole period, he remained in the cell. And finally, one of the Minister of the Interior or someone like that was asking me what they should do with him because they were thinking they might keep him in the cell indefinitely because maybe he's a terrorist. And I said, no, he's probably just a scared kid. So I recommended they send him back to America, right?
Oh, wow. Well, good for you.
Yeah, but he had bad skills though. So when I get in a situation like this, when I'm detained by a potentially hostile government, I try to work the person angles. You be friendly, try to convince people that I'm not a terrorist or whatever, and it worked out really well for me. Whereas he was trying the method of being really, hmm
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
yeah. So he was trying the method of being really aggressive. So he thought that what you have to do is treat them like they're a taxi driver in India that's trying to rip you off.
Oh.
Yeah, and that's not good at all. I mean, that's like he was trying to insist on his legal rights. Well, first of all, you don't have any legal rights. Legal rights are a fiction. I mean, they're present in America, but they're not present in Somalia. So by insisting on his legal rights and trying to be really aggressive, he's just pissing people off. So that's probably why he kept in the cell the whole time. Whereas for me, I was just being really friendly.
Yeah, that seems like a way better idea.
Yeah, and it worked. Like for instance, I had these.
How many times have you been in a situation like that where you've been detained by a potentially hostile government?
Oh, it happens a lot. So I had that in Nagorno-Karabakh. I was in their interior ministry place where the guy was threatening me in Russian, saying you will suffer worse than you ever suffered before. But he thought I was a spy or something. But I managed to talk my way out of that as well. And often in Africa you get detained by the police, but they're just trying to shake you down. So probably the DRC is the worst for that. You get like 8 a day on average.
Oh wow.
They're really bad. I almost wish that I could film it and then just put that on YouTube because it'd be so funny. I mean, it's really funny what goes on. Like I was there with one crazy Slovak guy. He's quite amusing. He likes. I went on an expedition to live with the Bambuti Pygmy tribe with him. So we were deep in the Congo living with this tribe, hunting antelope with spears and nets and stuff. But when we came near to the Kiss Kiss River, there's a place called Kisangani, and I was saying, let's go walk down by the river. And he said, well, I'm going to take my camera. And I go, yeah, okay, that should be all right. And he says, no, I just want to take my camera to show you something, what it is to travel as a photographer in Congo compared to just traveling. So he was walking with the camera around his neck. And we got detained 4 times just on the walk down to the river, which is like a couple hundred meters. So different branches of police would come and pick us up and then try to shake us down for money.
Wow. Because he had a camera?
Yeah, so he had a camera, so they thought he was probably a journalist.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Holy shit.
Yeah, so it was pretty funny. But I was able to, so I was using, you have to have a strategy for countries like this. So I was pretending to be a United Nations security inspector. So I had the clothes and the pants and the little pockets everywhere, like you know how these UN guys dress, right? And it was useful in that, useful to do it in that situation because there was a lot of armored, I guess it was like a Bangladeshi troop, but they had other people from other countries as well that were like an armored UN contingent because there had been a lot of mass rapes in that area, so they were trying to prevent it. And to a certain extent, I'm sure they prevented the mass rapes near their bases, so to some extent it helped. But because there was UN armor, like they actually had tanks and APCs and everything, it was worthwhile to try to pretend to be a UN guy. So I had a little card that was sort of fake. It wasn't really fake, but it was sort of fake because it was a card of someone else, and I knew that they were illiterate, so they can't read. So as far as they know, that's like a real UN card, even though the name didn't match my actual name.
It doesn't have a picture on it?
No, it was just like a laminated one. It's actually just I met this guy in Kazakhstan who happened to be a UN security inspector, and he gave me his business card. He just said, let's meet up for beer later. So I took his business card and I laminated it, and I just kept it because I knew it's written in Cyrillic anyway. So it's even harder for someone to try to decipher it. I knew that Africans can be quite illiterate sometimes, especially the police. So I just saved that because I knew when I did the DRC that, people say that when you come in through the area where it's problematic, like where the a lot of the rebel groups are, so like genocidal Hutu rebels and stuff like that, and some of the groups that are insurgents who are trying to overthrow the Rwanda government, or involved in that illegal mining, mixed up with the Chinese and that, they're quite aggressive. So you have to have a plan to get around that. So mine was, they would try to harass me.
That's really smart of you.
Yeah, I guess so. But I kind of, I've been thinking for years about it as well. So, I was thinking ahead. I knew I had to do the DRC at some point. Yeah, but my Slovak buddy, he went the other route. So he paid, I think, $3,000 to have a letter from the chief of the secret police of the Congo telling people not to bother him. And even then, he couldn't get everywhere. Like, he tried to go into some of the mines, and they wouldn't allow him. Because it's sort of like the government's kind of lost control there. It's mostly rebel groups. And they didn't want to mess with him because of his letter of from the secret police, because the secret police chief does have some power. But he's not infinitely powerful there. I mean, it is, Chinese commercial interests are probably the most dominant.
Were you able to get into those mines?
No, I didn't get into the Congo mines. But I saw other cool stuff, so, I can't complain. But I was surprised that he would even try that. And then afterward, he asked me, what's the most dangerous place? I need to go there right now to get some photographs. And I said, well, I just came from South Sudan. It's a shit show. I said, you'll find plenty of danger there. So he went off to South Sudan. Then I didn't see him for a while. And I think next year or the year after, I met him in downtown London. And I was like, so, last time I saw you were off to South Sudan. How was it? He goes, oh, it was excellent. Some rebels drove like a metal stake through my leg, and I almost died. And they said they were going to murder me. It was like, A Dinka tribe captured him at one point, and he had to have a buddy pay them $400 to get let go. But he got away with some photos, so he was quite happy.
Now, who are the Dinkas?
They're like one of the two groups in South Sudan that are probably most aggressive.
Okay.
So there's another group that I'm not sure if I pronounce, like Nore, or it starts with an N anyway. I didn't meet them as much. I met a few Dinka and I met a few of the other tribes, but I didn't meet the other one. But there's basically two dominant tribes, and maybe they have other tribes that are kind of aligned with them. And they're like the typical African cattle herders, but quite aggressive. And part of being a man there is you have to rustle cattle from neighboring tribes. So you can imagine cattle rustling when people have automatic weapons. It can get pretty violent, and you just have to scale that up a little bit, and you get to warfare.
Oh, okay. So, are there still a lot of Hutu rebels in Rwanda? Because I had another friend who went on a backpacking trip in Africa last year, and I've been publishing blogs based on his journal entries because I thought some of his stories were so interesting. But he didn't mention anything about any violence or anything when during the Rwanda portion of his trip. He just stayed in hostels with this tour group that he went with, and he didn't mention anything about the rebels or anything. But I mean, that might have been
Well, Rwanda itself is very peaceful.
Or something like that.
Yeah, Rwanda itself is unusually peaceful. So they were doing quite well, and I think people were kind of sick of violence there for a while. So they're toning themselves down. I mean, I went to Rwanda 2 or 3 times. I never saw anything. I mean, I think there was one grenade attack on some government officials or something. That's about it. But that's no worse than what happens in Ukraine. So Rwanda's quite peaceful. But when you get into that borderlands, that's where it's destabilized. And to a certain extent, the UN is responsible for that destabilization because they were trying to help refugees. And whenever you help refugees, you end up actually continuing the war and probably killing more people than if you don't help refugees.
How so?
Because so imagine that the conditions for African tribesmen are quite bad. Well, when you set up a refugee camp, all of a sudden you might say, oh, the conditions are terrible. Look, it's a refugee camp. But actually conditions might be 35% better than what they're used to at home. So you end up having a lot of population will move in there. So what you're doing is you're setting up new cities of an ethnic group that might be then willing to regroup and continue whatever war they're in. Because people, the purpose of war is to make peace. So, people are at war with each other. But after a while they come to peace because they say, oh, the suffering is so bad, we should actually make some compromises and we'll end the war. But when the UN comes in and tries to help, it more often than not continues the war because they're giving assistance to people who would otherwise give up on the war.
And do they have trouble governing the people within those refugee camps, particularly if they start to get overflowing with people or something like that?
Yeah, they're unable to govern them essentially because to govern something to govern Africans, you should probably be an African, and your methods for governing are probably not acceptable to international organizations because most
based on Western values or something.
Yeah, and Western values are too soft to govern people who are not at a Western level. People are very they're almost feminine in the West, whereas in a place like Africa or what Asia used to be, or even in Europe, if you go back far enough, you find that the people are a bit more aggressive, and so Western methods are not going to work.
Oh, okay. Oh, wow.
Yeah, so you end up with these lawless regions, and usually rebel groups sort of base themselves out of that. And whoever's the UN force, they're not really, they don't really have a mandate to be colonialists, so they can't really go and clamp down. Like if you were 19th century colonist people, you would be able to clamp down and run a place like that. But it's very nasty. It's better to let people do their own dirty work, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
So.
wow, this is all so complex, and I mean, it also makes me think a little bit about how to a certain extent it kind of gives merit to. Well, it kind of gives merit, but also points out flaws in philosophies like anarcho-capitalism, because you could say that if you have no government whatsoever, then you get these rebel groups. But then, like you were saying, these rebel groups, they're often better at governing those areas than the UN would be, which is a government organization.
Yeah, so it's like in Cameroon, for instance, there's almost no wildlife left anywhere, except when you go where these Lamido guys, the tribal chiefs, are in charge. And they have wildlife in the regions around where they have their government or whatever you call it. It's a tribal government, it's not very advanced. But in a way, it's far more effective than what the Westerners try. So in these game reserves that are run by the chiefs, there is actually animals still there. And what it is these chiefs will just go medieval on you if you go and violate their game reserve. And so that's why the animals are still there. They'll like grab someone and just torture them to death publicly. So no one wants to go there. But in other areas that are just run by the government, where they're trying to make reasonable laws, it's absolutely stripped bare. There's not an animal to be found.
Oh, wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, so like the feudal or like medieval style of extreme viciousness is often what keeps order in some of these places. Because they're people, they're warriors basically. It's like Conan the Barbarian type thing, right? A lot of them are. And sometimes there's stuff that's very, very violent, but people don't even notice it. Like, for instance, in Bali, you have all these hippies go there, and they're like, oh, Bali, it's so nice. And it is so nice. But what they don't know is, how that order is kept. So, I used to go there a bit in the 90s, and I have an ex-girlfriend. She lives there all the time. And so I know actually how things were done and how it became established as like a beach resort and places where like people could go for spiritual retreats and for like spas and stuff like that. But what it was is associations of businessmen, and they would have gangs on the street who would look for anyone making trouble. And if someone was making trouble, let's say a purse snatcher arrived, well, they'd beat the shit out of him. And if they saw him again, they'd kill him.
Holy shit.
Yeah, so that's not an acceptable law by any Western standard. And yet that's what kept order there. And I was asking one business guy who was involved in this, I said, why is this necessary? And he said, if even one newspaper report of a purse snatching gets into a Japanese newspaper, the tourism will drop by like 35% over the next few months from Japan. And he was saying, we have people here who, like, they're very dependent on these jobs. I mean, during the economic crisis, having a job is the only thing that would keep people fed. They were just working for food. So they can't have a 35% drop in the tourists. So for them, it's very important that nothing interrupt the tourist flow. But a purse snatcher definitely interrupts the tourist flow, because he said especially Japanese were very sensitive to it. So one account of a purse snatching, or if it got in a major newspaper in Japan, which sometimes it would, and you see no Japanese tourists for like months. Yeah, so he was explaining why it's necessary to have such violent gangs. So what they'll do is they'll go along to the street, and if they see someone who's non-local, they're like, who are you? And the guy will like give some name, and they're like, you're from around here? And they know who's from this neighborhood. And if he said, I'm from the next neighborhood over, they would actually like march him over and say, so where exactly are you from this next neighborhood? Like, you have to be some local person. You can't just be some random who just showed up, right? Because they're thinking, are you someone here to cause trouble? And they don't want any trouble. I mean, they have to have like drunk, elderly Australians walking around with gold wedding rings, and they have to be okay. And this was in a country where during the 90s it's so poor that some people can barely eat. Well, that requires a fair amount of force to be able to maintain that peace, and the force was physical.
Yeah, so obviously you have a lot of experience with understanding that different types of government work well for different cultures. That's like gives so much credence to like how flawed the notion, this like neoconservative notion is that we should just spread American style democracy everywhere, because that's like completely incompatible with some cultures, as you're talking about.
Yeah, because it depends on their level of development. So for Americans, American style culture works, but for other people, not so much. I mean, it's the same thing with like Iraq or Afghanistan. Like, a lot of people are saying you need to have like American values to run them. Well, American values are not going to suit them. So to a certain degree they will, but to a certain degree they won't. I mean, things have to be much tougher. Just because of the background there. I mean, recently I had a chance to advise the guy who might well become the Minister for Housing and Urban Development for Afghanistan. So I was doing a conference. Yeah, so it's quite interesting. Yeah, and he was wondering what model. So he knows a lot about housing, but he doesn't know so much about urban development. So he was asking. One of my buddies is here who travels quite a lot, and myself also. Of course, I travel a ridiculous amount. So we've seen like how the public transport systems work and how civic development goes on in different countries around the world. So we were trying to suggest to him the best models. Well, I think he was saying that what the government was favoring right now was the Singapore model. And I was trying to argue that the Singapore model might not be as useful as other models. So maybe right in the middle of some of the larger cities, you might be able to use some aspects of the Singapore model. But I thought, from around the world where I saw people dealing with situations that are closer to Afghanistan's, this was like the favelas of Brazil and Medellin in Colombia. Because they had problem of civil war, massive cultivation of drugs, warlords in charge of part of the city, gang warfare, like all of these problems, right? Whereas Singapore doesn't have those problems. So I don't think the Singapore model is necessarily going to work. So
you were saying that it's also similar because of the mountainous terrain to the favela style, right?
Yeah, so Afghanistan also has really mountainous terrain, and they did some unusual things. Like in Medellin, they had escalators that are brightly colored, and they're covered over so the sun doesn't beat down on them all the time. And this will go up into these really dangerous, like crime-ridden, poor neighborhoods. So it gives them some way to come, back and forth from the city and maybe get a job downtown. And it's quite useful that way. And they even had like little gondolas, things that were hanging from a steel line, going along between various higher areas of the city. So this is a possibility. Yeah, types of public transportation that other people haven't thought about.
Right, yeah, that's a really different, that indicates a lot of difference in terms of infrastructure like you were telling me about before.
Yeah, and also
So
the Medellin model.
what exactly is the Singapore model, though?
The Singapore model, I think that it was based mostly on trying to expand the train system. And it also was based upon like being able to make public housing for people who seemed quite orderly. So I'm not sure how much it would work. I mean, maybe in the middle of some of the bigger cities, you could try to plan in the future to do that. But I don't see the Afghans as that orderly. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and one of the things about the South American model as well, the favela and the model from Medellin, is they said that the way to succeed was to deal with the bad actors. Because usually in charge of neighborhoods, there's some sort of drug lord, or he's a warlord. And you might be saying, oh, that's bad, you shouldn't talk to him, he's the guy causing the trouble. And what the Medellin model was saying, yes, he is the guy causing the trouble, but if you don't get him on board, there's no way to solve the problem. So they were actually going out, as the NGOs or as the person in charge of development, and they were going and talking directly to the drug lord or the warlord and saying, okay, we want to bring like public transport into your neighborhood, and we want to improve the sewage, and you've got to work with him, so you got to get him to sign off on it. So it means that it's not ethically perfect. Because you wonder why you're even talking to this guy. He's a mass murderer. You could say things like that. But if you say that, then you don't make any progress.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, sometimes being ethical is not pragmatic at all.
Yeah, so it's almost like the Noam Chomsky theory where he's so ethical that he can't actually do anything, right?
Yeah. I mean, like people demonize Sam Harris a lot, but I agree with him sometimes still, although Hunter Motz in particular has helped point out some things that I no longer agree with him about. But I agree with his criticism, well, some of his criticisms at least, of Noam Chomsky. Like he acts like Americans are always the demons, and he doesn't focus on intentions at all and how there are differences in intentions. And like he is so ethical that he's not pragmatic to an extent, and taking into account like the realities of what the culture is like in different countries, like you were talking about.
And also when you get arrested by armed forces. So I've noticed that when it's the Americans, I don't have any worries at all. Like my stress level doesn't go up very much. Like for instance, when I was in Mosul during Operation Iron Grip phase of the Second Gulf War, I was arrested by a bunch of Americans. And I wasn't, I was just joking around with them.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, even though they had me at gunpoint and everything else. I mean, I was just having fun with them, so it wasn't too much of a worry. But, when I'm arrested by other, armed forces, I'm more nervous. So it just shows that whatever I was to say, even if I said, oh, Americans are the worst, someone could tell that I was bullshitting if they had, like, the readout of my heart rate. Because they'd say, well, look at when you're arrested by Americans and when you're arrested by Iranians or different African groups. You can see that my heart rate would be faster. Like, for instance...
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, like for instance, there's one time, it was just police. But this was in the Republic of Congo, not in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And they were actually, the whole, police station around me were beating each other bloody over who would get the opportunity to steal money from me.
Holy shit.
Yeah, and that's the police, right? They are the police. So you can see my heart rate is higher at that point, right, than when the Americans, maybe they're trying to be threatening, but I know they're not that threatening, really.
Yeah, I think it's like the fact that there are any situations in which you get captured by people with guns, but your heart rate doesn't go up, is indicative that you have experience with those sorts of situations. Because there are a lot of people, like probably me, for example, who, if I got captured by anyone with guns, even if they were Americans or someone like that, my heart rate would probably go up, I would say.
Yeah. Well, you get used to it after a while. Yeah, because there's, like armed forces stopping people and being a bit rough is quite common around the world. But I found if you just joke around with them, it usually works out pretty good.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, I've never had too much trouble.
To go back to what you were saying about Bali before, to ask you, what is it that attracts hippies to Bali?
They believe that it's really, really spiritual there. But I think in a way that this, I'm not sure how this got started. I think it might have been because of the 3Ks. You know how the hippies used to do Kathmandu and Kabul and Kuta. So
No, I
Kuta's
didn't
on.
know that.
Oh, okay. So it used to be in the 70s. It was the 3Ks. So all the hippies wanted to go do the 3Ks, and one of them's Kuta, and that's where they end up. So I think a lot of them sort of conglomerated there, and then almost like people on the left to some degree. I mean, I don't want to overgeneralize, but to some degree, if I meet people on the left who are traveling, they think that they're the most likely to live with the common people, but actually they're one of the least likely. So, because what they do is they actually go to safe spaces. So if you talk to someone who's a bit of a hippie, you'd say, "Oh yeah, did you go to Nicaragua?" They go, "Oh yeah, I went to this place on the lake where it's like a hippie collective." And you'll find they spent all their time there. Or if you say, "Oh, did you go to India?" They'd be like, "Yeah, I was in India for 8 months." You go, "Oh wow, what did you see?" And they would list like 3 ashrams, would be like 3/4 of the time they spent there, and the rest of it they spent in Goa. So it's all like spaces where you're around other hippies that are kind of walled off in a sense, and inside they try to pretend that everything's really, really spiritual.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a safe space in a way. So, if you go to India and you go to an ashram full of Western hippies with some guru trying to teach you something, or maybe he's even teaching you yoga or something more useful, well, it's not the same as if you're traveling around in India, like staying in the local hotels talking to the people.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so the hippies like to have an area where they kind of, I think it's because when they go to the third world, they find it's not what they said that it was going to be. Like they have this idea that it's like maybe it's the noble savage, or the idea that America has to be really, really bad. So when you go to another country, it has to be all peaceful and everything's great and like the sexes are equal and everything else. And when they don't find that, I think they have to look for that, right? So they create their own little spaces. So it's really common for people on the left.
Like especially with what you're saying, it seems like a lot of those countries that they idolize, they're actually much less progressive in terms of the things that they love so much, like gender roles, than America.
Yeah, wait, they're really old fashioned. They're actually really, really conservative. Like someone who's like disappointed with Trump, but they say, "Oh, I really like India." You're like, "Whoa, like don't you know that India is like Trump times 10, right?" So with their government there, the BJP or whatever they call it, they're like really, really, really conservative Hindu. So yeah, it's quite funny. And also when I hear them complain and stuff, like they complain about a Nike factory. And you say, "Well, what is it you actually complain about with this Nike factory?" And they say, "Well, the conditions are not good for the workers." And you say, "Okay, well, what do you think this Kuta place is?" Because in a way, it's like a tourist factory. So all the people are coming in to be on the beach, and it's all going to spas. But if you got like local businessmen enforcing gangs who beat the shit out of people or even kill them if they disobey, well, in a way, that's like the factory floor, and the condition for the workers is not necessarily good because they better not step out of line. So if anything, it's more harsh and more right wing than what they're saying the Nike factory is.
That's a very good point.
Mm-hmm.
And even in like some third world countries or places like that too, like even like people, especially in our Western cultures here, they would criticize and feel really ethically and morally terrible about like child labor and stuff like that there. But I mean, in some places, and I'm sure you understand this a hell of a lot better than me, that's better than the alternative, like trying to scrounge around for a job or like joining one of those tribal gangs or something like that.
Yeah, the kids are quite desperate to work quite often, and they're I had an ex-girlfriend once who was in charge of the UN program for part of Central Asia for trying to prevent child labor, and she was talking to me about the difficulties of it. And you do have people where it's they're a child, but if they don't work, they can't eat. So it's a very hard choice. So it's a very slow process. You have to really approach it in a systematic way and work slowly toward trying to reduce it. But you can't just come in and try to wave a magic wand because it's not going to work. I mean, unless you have massive funding, which is unlikely.
That makes a lot of sense. And like the theme that you've already mentioned so far is that cultures change slowly, which is another thing that I've learned a lot more about in the last year or so, I would say.
Yeah, and they're not necessarily wrong in the way they handle things. Like, for instance, that Mr. Okay, here's just something that came to mind, because I mentioned I was talking to Mr. Dude when I was on that plane flying into Puntland. Well, he was telling a story on the plane about how around the time of the collapse of the central government, he was a lad, and he'd actually he looted some AKs from the government armory when the government fell, and then he eventually traded them for some camels. But he was saying when he was a teenager that once he noticed this young boy ran from behind the sand dune, and he was bleeding out the ass. And like all the elders were wondering what the hell is going on. And they go to the other side of the sand dune, and they found like some pedo guy was there, and he'd raped the boy.
Holy fuck.
Yes, and then so I said, well, what happened to him? And he said, I'm not totally sure, but I can 100% guess because I heard like the crack of an AK, and he was never seen again. So the elders just went to the other side. They saw him like, oh, this guy's like a child rapist. They just put a bullet through his head. And I was thinking, okay, well, fair enough, because what are you going to do if you're... Okay, so now people who are very modern might criticize that. And they say, well, why didn't they what? What else could you do, right? So you got, if you ask, what did we do in Canada for that? Well, we spend $1 million trying to rehabilitate them. You say, well, what's the success rate? Well, 1%. 99%, they're the same and they'll reoffend. You're like, well, first of all, Somalis don't have $1 million. Their budget for like social services is probably $3. So that's enough to, they can buy a bullet. That's it. They can. You could say, well, could you banish them to another tribe? Well, that's not very nice though, because then he's going to be offending in the other tribes. So you can't really do that. And you say, well, can't you imprison them? Well, they don't have money for prisons. They have barely enough money to feed themselves. So it's like they take a response to a crime that we couldn't in Canada. But of course, in Canada, we have the funding to, try something much more elaborate, but they don't have that funding. So, someone asked me once if I criticized what the Somalis did given that crime in that situation. I'm saying, well, no, I'm not in a position where I can criticize that.
That's a really good point. Yeah, like justice and the way we do it in our culture and rehabilitation is fucking expensive, man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's like in some parts of West Africa, if someone's crazy, like they're really schizophrenic, they're really dangerous, what they'll do is take a rope and just tie them to the tree. And then they'll bring over a bowl of food every day and feed them. And they just live on this rope almost like a dog. And some people were criticizing that. And okay, you can criticize that. But then you say, well, what would you do instead? Well, and they'd say, well, I do this and this and this and this. And you say, oh, no. What would you do given your budget? You have $2 a month to deal with this problem. And you say, well, $2 a month, that about pays for the food and the rope. So, given their actual level of development, that's the only thing they can do. Now, as they get richer, they can have a proper facility, and that'd be a good thing. But, there's just not funding for that. And the thing is, if you say, well, Westerners should give funding, well, Westerners are not very inclined to give funding. Nor should they. I don't even think it's very effective because I talk to a lot of aid workers around that. A lot of them are, they're enjoying what they do, but they also realize the limitations of it because you remove agency from the people that you're working with if you come in and try to solve their problems. And it's actually better to have them learn to solve their own problems. So, it'd be better if the town would slowly learn to have a tax base and they're trying to solve whatever problem they have with members who are mentally ill and other kind of violations. And, gradually they learn and become a more modern government, which they're in the process of doing. But when NGOs come in, often they screw up and they end up doing stuff that's counterproductive.
So would you say the better alternative would just to be to pretty much leave them alone and let them solve these problems themselves? Well,
I think that we can't leave them alone because you have certain people that they have a calling to help. And that's fine because that's part of the human condition. And in a way that's good because they're furthering and accepting a culture of being that kind of person. But I think in most countries that kind of thing doesn't work. So it would actually be better if someone said they really want to help people. Like if you're an American, you really want to help people, you're probably better off to try to help Americans because you understand the situation better. But some people, it's not enough to help Americans. They're kind of romantic and they want to go somewhere else and try to help. And usually they don't end up helping. Like for instance, I think the UN did a study of people who are trying to prevent famines, and they found out that 2/3 of the famines were created by people trying to prevent famines. Yeah,
shit, really?
Yeah. And when they tallied up the deaths, they found there was more deaths caused by people trying to prevent famines than there was by people but then there was saved by people trying to, help. So it'd be better off for the world if no one was trying to help with famines.
So how does that happen?
Okay, well imagine. So I'm not sure if you ever played this really boring game called Bingo.
Yeah, I played that.
You played it. Okay, so it's kind of boring, but it's a bit exciting toward the end because I've only played it like once or twice. But toward the end, there's probably 20 people in the room who are almost at bingo, right? For everyone that actually gets the bingo, because you only have to be one square away, and you're almost at bingo. Well, the thing is, for famines, there's all these interacting things that might cause crop failure, or might cause a lack of food in an area, and usually toward the end, if let's say there hasn't been rain for a while, in the most simple example, usually toward the end there is some rain, and the crops will come back. But at a certain point, you're kind of getting nervous if you're an NGO because you're seeing, the chance of a famine is going up, and now it's 18%, and now it's 22%. And you know that if you don't do anything to prepare, then there could be a famine and you'll be completely unprepared and a lot of people will die. So usually what happens is, to err on the safe side, which they have to, they start putting out the warning that there might be a famine. And this is the problem with the funding of NGOs, because it would be different if NGOs were just given funding. But the fact is they have to produce funding by using advertising, in a sense, because they have to advertise enough for people to give money. Yeah, so what they do...
Like anticipate problems before they happen.
Yeah, and then they've got to make everyone aware. They've got to raise awareness.
Zealous about it.
Well, here's the thing. If you raise awareness of a famine, then the locals are going to be interested too. They say, oh, the NGOs in the area are sounding the alarm. There might be a famine this year. Well, what happens then is the middle class people in the area, they stock up on food so as to make sure that if there is a famine, they won't be the ones who starve. So they'll stock up on food more than they would have normally. And also neighboring counties or countries will think, oh, there could be a famine. Let's ban food exports so that for sure the famine won't affect us. And the thing is, in these areas, it's quite sophisticated with the trading routes. So, they are trading food back and forth. And if you ban trade, well, then you might have an area that's actually not self-sufficient in the kinds of foods you need to survive. But they don't mind because people, carry food here or there on the backs of donkeys, whatever it is. But when that gets stopped, suddenly they're in a famine situation. So quite often you get it's almost a famine. The NGOs sound the alarm. And because of the way money is raised through appeals on television or whatever to people to give money, it's just one example, then this raises the profile of the famine, and you might actually cause a famine even though there was no famine. So for every famine there was, there might be 10 that are almost a famine. And because the NGOs raise the alarm, then it actually causes a famine. Whereas if they'd done nothing, there would have been no famine.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because people stockpile food. So the famine's often the poorest people who can't stockpile food end up with the famine. So you could have a normal harvest for a year, but all the middle class people stockpiled grain, and the poor people can't afford it. Now, thousands of them die of starvation.
Holy shit. Wow, that's fucked up.
Yeah, so it's a systematic problem. Because these agricultural systems are often quite complicated. I remember one time in Mali, I was visiting the Dogon tribesmen, and I had a guide with me. He was a pretty good, he could speak English and French pretty good. And so when we were walking by a farmer, I was admiring his crops. And I was saying, wow, let's talk to him a little bit. And I was saying, yeah, your crops are really excellent. And he was saying, no, he's really disappointed. And, I was asking what the problem was. And, the guide, was nodding and kind of talking to him in Dogon. I didn't really understand. But later he explained to me that this guy shorts the agricultural market. So he was growing onions, but he was growing onions on a weird microclimate in the valley. And it's actually really hard to get your donkey up there. And it's like a pain in the ass even to bring the onions down from there. And the onions were fine, but his problem was the onions were fine down in the valley too. And the thing is, 70% of the time, the onions are fine down in the valley, but 30% of the time there's an onion crop failure in the valley, in which case his onions in the microclimate, they always succeed. So they'll in that microclimate, they grow the same every year. But then the price of onions will really increase 3 or 4 times, and then he'll make his money by selling his smaller amount of onions. But at least in general, the people will get some onions. Yeah, and you see what you do to that. So he's shorting the market, but in a way he's providing stability to the market. Now, if you came in as an NGO and you were like, oh, onion crop failure in the valley, and you just brought in truckloads of onions, well, then you're taking away the spike in profit that makes him want to short the market. So he might decide then he's not shorting the market because it's a pain in the ass to go all the way up there in that microclimate to grow. So then you'll have no one growing that microclimate. And then what you'll have is a much more severe onion shortage next time there's a crop failure. So you can see how the way, if you begin to help in this way with a system you don't understand, it's the problem with Westerners coming in and just barging in oh, I'm a Westerner, I know so much. Well, not necessarily. Yeah. You have to be very serious about things. If you're someone who wants to help out in Mali with agriculture, then you can't be someone who comes over on a school holiday and you want to put this on your resume or whatever that you helped out. You got to be someone who really, really, really understands what's going on.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and that's rare.
That reminds me of this documentary I watched about international aid organizations and how they often end up causing more problems than they solve when they do things like they just bring people food and clothes and shoes and stuff like that, and then they cause these countries to be reliant on the aid organizations instead of setting up markets. And it's that biblical quote: if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. If you teach a man to fish, you feed him for life, or something like that. It would be a much better idea to try to create jobs and stimulate the market for these people so that they can grow their own crops, so they can grow their own food, and you can teach them to make their own clothes and stuff like that too.
Yeah, exactly. Like, for instance, in the news just a couple days ago, I was reading, well, someone invented a really, really good mosquito repellent. So it lasted for 72 hours. And
Oh wow.
yeah, and then they were talking about it, and they said, well, we're going to sell it in the West, and for each bottle that you buy, we're going to ship a bottle to be given away for free to the poor people. And I was thinking, oh no, it's terrible, right? That's not the way to do it. Because, if someone did that to, imagine there was a really rich, like Martians or something, and they said, oh, Earthlings, they're so poor. For every car you buy on Mars, we'll just give a car to the poor people of America. And then America would protest, and they'd say, what the hell? This is dumping. So you're dumping your product. And what you do is you would cause a collapse of the American car industry, and everyone would just wait for the Martian cars to appear. So, the better way to handle it is not to give a bottle for free to a poor country. Or, and the same with clothes being distributed that way. Or there was a guy doing it with, I forget what it was, shoes as well, just giving it away in Africa. And the African countries are quite angry about it, especially the ones who know a bit of economics, because that's dumping. You're really damaging their economy. What they should have said is, we're gonna have a plant making this mosquito repellent. We'll sell it in America. And also, in some African countries, we're going to make a plant paying African wages on African land, African building, and African workers working there. And we're going to also make it there and sell it at prices that Africans can afford.
That sounds like a much better idea.
Yeah, so that's the way to do it. 'Cause then you're not destroying their economy, right? Or giving away stuff for free like that, you're ruining their mosquito repellent economy. You can imagine the protests of other people that are trying to sell mosquito repellent in Africa. So it's just a kind of economic disruption that's uncalled for.
That's a good point too. Yeah, for sure. So we haven't. This is all really fascinating, and I'm sure we could talk. I want to talk to you as many more times as possible on my podcast about all these travel stories, to be honest. But we haven't gotten to talking about evolution.
Oh yeah, let's go over to evolution.
Do you want to talk about that?
Okay, well, let me see. So, first of all, what part of evolution were you interested in?
Well, I guess I just wanted to talk about what got us talking about it in the first place. Basically, about how controversial the idea of group selection is in evolutionary biology. So we could talk about that in terms of the things we talked about before, like how Jonathan Haidt and David Sloan Wilson are popularizing this idea that's common, particularly in sociobiology, about group selection. And I guess for people watching this who don't know, it's the idea. It's actually partially, once I learned about it, it's what helped me become less of a militant atheist, because I used to be a militant atheist, but now I would say I'm just an atheist, and I dropped the militant part and I try to accept people's religions. Anyway, I got that way because the idea is, it's kind of about how, it's kind of like whether religion was an evolutionary adaptation, or whether it's like an unnatural and unwanted byproduct of some other evolutionary feature. So, and now I'm kind of more sold on this idea, but I understand that it's not like 100% accepted, and it still has controversial aspects about it. So we can talk about just all the...
Okay, well, how I got into it was I was interested in, I think it was Isaiah was saying that people are very postmodern, and they're extremely unlikely to change their opinions on whatever it is that they hold an opinion on. And they're kind of just looking from, I guess the postmodernists were saying they're coming from a certain point of view, and that's how they see the world, and they can't really alter from that. And I was wondering if that was true. So I noticed for mixed mental arts, and maybe as a result of pushing by Hunter, I'm not sure, but there seemed to be a very hardcore, like, group selection is correct and kin selection is wrong. So kin selection is like the normal evolutionary, like the more mainstream evolutionary idea of how the selection goes on within a larger groups of people. And so there's a guy named Hamilton made something called kin selection. And when I saw this argument going on about it, it seemed to cast aspersions. Like some people, like Dawkins, are very nasty because they hold to the kin selection, and other ones like Wilson are supposed to be very morally correct because they hold to the group selection. I was just laughing when I saw that, because the two theories, they almost sit on top of each other. Like the difference between them is so minor, and yet it seemed quite important to the group that Wilson had to be right and Dawkins was wrong. And I was just thinking about this.
Explain how they sit on top of each other.
Okay, well, okay, so you have, well, first of all, you have both Wilson and Dawkins agree that most evolution is like, the usual way as Darwin was explaining. So let's say that's 90% of it. And then,
Harmony and natural selection.
yeah, so natural selection and other things like trying to avoid parasites, because all these things that might cause evolution. And so they were 90% in agreement already. And then one of them is saying that it's the kin group is the one that's causing this selection. The other one's saying, no, it's just the group. But you ask, like, a group of what? Well, a group of people, a group of individuals who are in the same species. Well, what are they technically to each other? Well, they're kin to each other. Because, they're, like humans are 99.9% similar or whatever it is, right? We just have a few, like, base pairs that are different. Like, essentially, we're all, like, brothers and sisters to some degree. But the group selection doesn't want to mention that, whereas the kin selection is kind of has that foremost. But essentially, it's the same. So it's like a group of kin or some kin who are in a group. So this is like the extra thing going on.
There's a division between the two camps because, like I was talking about, how like some atheists use arguments against group selection to argue against religion, and then people on the other side use it to argue for religion.
Yeah, and the thing is, you can't really make, like, there's such a small difference between them. It's a highly technical argument. And at first I was somewhat deceived because I thought, oh, mixed mental arts people must be really, really into these minute differences. Because I had studied the differences between this in the 80s. So I read like maybe a dozen books directly on it and listened into a lot of conversations about it. And I thought, wow, this is really, really like splitting hairs. So it was one of my first, contacts as a young man with something that was what we call an academic argument. Because really, like, you're splitting hairs on top of a split hair, on top of a split hair, on top of a negligible difference. So it's just important to the academics. And finally, by like one arse hair's difference, the community said, okay, we're going to go with the one that Dawkins champions. We're going to go with the kin selection. Mostly because it sort of seemed like he came up with a name first. So it's almost like the whole Brontosaurus, Apatosaurus controversy. Who's the one who named it first? Because they're almost the same, right? But also, to some small degree, it seems like kin selection might be ever so slightly better or right, even though group selection, has some things where it's better and right. But it almost seems like the tiny little bit that the kin selection is slightly better than the group selection is, like the slight edge to it. So I can see why the community decided to go with the kin selection terminology. But it's so minor. Like, if someone waved a magic wand and now everything was group selection terminology instead of kin selection, it would make no difference to the scientific community. And most of them are quite bored with the argument. So I was kind of surprised to see in mixed mental arts how it was considered so important, and there are all these ramifications that flow from it. But really, there's nothing that flows from it. They're almost the same.
Oh, see, I didn't realize that. I've read some of Dawkins' books, and I've watched lots of his videos and stuff like that. And I've never heard him mention I've never heard anyone really that I can think of. Although no, I guess in more recent books that I've read about it, they have mentioned that, but I haven't heard him or other people like that mention the similarities between group selection and kin selection. It seems like with people like him, it almost seems like this debate about whether groups can actually evolve behaviors together, or if it's like one person or if only one person can evolve a particular behavior at a time or something like
Yeah, so it's a small pressure, first of all. So we're already talking about a very small pressure. And then you have this this problem where the groups are also kin. So they're almost on top of each other. But why they don't point that out too much is because for evolutionary theory, they're often talking about very small effects. So they don't want to be saying, oh, that's like bum nibbling or whatever, because then someone could say, well, everything you guys work on is like that. It's all academic arguments. So probably like 80% of what they work on is these little academic arguments and matters of terminology. But almost everyone else in the evolutionary area of study, they're not interested in this argument anymore. They just want to move on. They're saying, okay, we went with the kin selection terminology. Maybe it was not very fair. Maybe we should have like thrown a bone to Wilson. But no one really cares anymore. They're on to new things. So it's there's actually.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so there's nothing that really flows from it. It's more a matter of legacy. So I think what you have is aging scientists, and they're wondering how they're going to be seen by history. And I think Wilson, he seems like quite a nice guy. And if I was talking to him, I'd have no problem using his group selection terminology. It's just bad luck that the other one was given the edge. It was seen to be slightly prior, and some people thought it explained slightly more in these few tiny differences. But his terminology is pretty good too. And they had someone studying bacterial mats now, where it seems like some of them do break off in groups. And it seemed like his group selection theory might be a better terminology for that particular thing. But then you have to ask, how often does that happen? And I think
Right.
it's not, it's not very common. So it's like one species. There seems to be a little bit of that going on, but it's so minor, and hardly anyone's interested in that anymore.
So what have they moved on to?
They've moved on to. It used to be fresh in my mind, but there was like a list of stuff. I mean, the epigenetics is quite important, and the effects of parasites. Some people were looking at the if what was behind the evolution of intelligence is an interesting area where they're talking about now, and
Genetics is fascinating.
yeah, so that's more more interesting for people. And there's a few other ones that are the evolution of intelligence argument is quite interesting to me anyway, and it seems like a lot of the evolutionary people are looking in on that. I mean, there's some new findings. Some people were thinking that it might be because of the socialization of the group that it led to intelligence, but some other people were actually arguing that the large groups that socialize actually leads to a little bit stupider people. And it seems like a lot of evidence has come out in favor of their view now. So, the first evidence was from hyenas, where people were looking at groups of hyenas, and they're saying this doesn't fit with the socialization model, because it seems like the ones who are more the loners seem to be more intelligent than the ones who hang out most in the groups. So if anything, it seemed the pressure was the opposite way. And then someone else was finding something similar happening with humans. So it could be that when you have a large group of humans, there's a lot of people freeloading. So as you get a larger group, you have some less pressure to get a bigger brain.
Oh, the free rider problem, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a fascinating area. I mean, of course, these things are never they're never settled. Sometimes you have to be very patient. I notice it's another thing that it's part of the idea of mixed mental arts that you're not supposed to be patient. Like we're supposed to push toward immediate resolutions of these things. But actually, a lot of these problems, even though it's a small problem, it could be a 100-year problem, or it could be a 200-year problem. Like I read a lot of science, so every so often I do follow these problems. There's some problems I follow for 30 years or even 40 years, at the utmost. And I've noticed some of them do get solved. So every so often we find the solution to a mystery, but quite often people have to continue working on it. So I think for science you have to be very, very patient.
Yeah, I think so too. That's often what kind of the point that I try to make. I'm reminded right now of the gun control chat that we had. Like I was basically making the point several times that to solve problems like this, I think unfortunately the best way to do it, because even if you make new laws, people aren't necessarily going to obey those laws, and even if they do, they might not necessarily be that effective. The best way to solve these sorts of problems is by changing cultural mindsets towards guns, which takes a lot of time, and you have to be open-minded and talk to people about it, basically.
Mm-hmm. And then you have to ask, do you even want to change the mindset? Because the fact that Americans have guns, it seems quite crazy to a lot of other people. Not to Yemenis who do the same thing, but but you could argue that in fact they do argue that there's some social benefit to it that's almost hard to quantify, because they're saying the chance of a government getting really aggressive is less if the people have guns, because it keeps the government under control, and that's something you can never measure. So the people who are pushing for science to get more involved in social policy, they have the same problem that my way of explaining it is that the Drake equation.
I've heard of it before, but I don't remember what it is.
So it's like an attempt to calculate how many civilizations there are in the universe.
Oh, okay.
And there's all these terms for it, like the percentage chance that an advanced civilization will develop on a planet. How many planets are there? How many stars that can support a planet that's suitable for life? And it's all these terms. But a lot of them are unknown. And some of them you can say, well, 70% of stars might have a planet. Like you can actually put a number in there. But then other ones are like, what number of stars are. Oops, someone tried to call me, sorry. So what number of stars are.
I lost you for a second.
Yeah, someone was trying to call. I think it's a girl who wants to go to the beach with me. Yeah, but anyway, yeah. Yeah, some of these terms are very hard to quantify. So like what percentage of stars, might become so hot that they'll kill off the life. Like you have all these terms that you can't really know. And it's the same thing with social policy. So you say like in the Drake equation for gun control, there's something said to what degree does having an armed population prevent the government from becoming like a really hardcore fascist or hardcore communist? And you have to say, well, that's just X. No one knows.
Yeah, but I mean, like you were saying, I'm sure it deters it to some degree, regardless of what that number is.
Yeah, so it probably does deter it, but then is that worth the extra deaths that come as a result of people having the guns? So it's like it's
Yeah,
hard to say. It comes down to a value judgment. So in the end, like you could spend like tens of millions of dollars to have scientists go and quantify to an exact degree all kind of things in that equation for gun control. But one thing they can't figure out would be that term. And when you can't figure out that term, like you might get something very precise, almost the way Spock would talk, like the final term is 5.132x. Well, what's X? Don't know. Well, then in that case, then you don't know. Like, why did you spend all this money to get such an exact knowledge of the other term? Because you don't know what X is. But with gun control, there's probably like X, Y, and Z. So you have like many terms that are unknown, and there's no amount of money that can study that because we don't have like multiple Earths. We're not like Rick and Morty where we can look at different timelines to see what happens where. So as a
I
result,
love Rick and Morty.
yeah, yeah, it's a great show. Yeah, so there's no way to know. So in the end, like I don't think it's worth money to. It's not worth spending money on the larger problem of should you have an armed population like in America or not, because science can't answer that. Because there's going to be these unknowns that can never be answered that are so large that they overwhelm the advantage of having an exacting knowledge for other terms in the equation.
And also, like when science has been applied to social policy and government policy before, you've gotten things like eugenics.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and I think we're coming into an era of eugenics again too. The
You
way,
think so?
yeah, with what's happening with CRISPR and a lot of this genetic stuff, it's getting cheaper and cheaper.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, and I think
yeah. That's a fascinating thing to and think about too. Like should people be allowed to edit the genes of their children and stuff like that? And will that lead to those sorts of things? And should it be allowed? Should it not be allowed? It's hard. It's so hard to say.
yeah, and I think that the big data is coming in to be a little bit helpful toward that now. So it looks like there are some genes that can boost intelligence a bit. But in general, it seems like hundreds or even thousands of genes are involved. So I don't think you can like make everyone super genius or whatever. And I'm sure there's trade-offs as well. Like as you try to make everyone a higher IQ, you probably drop off some other aspects of intelligence that would have been,
Yeah,
also valuable. So it's going to be problematic. But I think you probably could get maybe a 5 or 10% boost if you're to
yeah.
really really go hard on the eugenics. Now, whether society wants to do that, I don't know. But I'd imagine that some people who are wealthier would.
The brain is so complicated too, and neuroscience is like we're just scratching the surface of neuroscience. There isn't one part of the brain that does one thing. They're all like connected to a certain extent, and like you were saying, like there isn't one gene that does one thing. Like the language gene, for example. I think I wrote a blog about that a while ago. Like how Noam Chomsky, for example, argued that there's this one gene that shows how language was formed and how we have this language. All humans have this language structure, and it seems like there are other genes associated with that too. So that has more merit, but it doesn't necessarily even mean that like there's this one gene that does that one thing. Like it could have done other things. Maybe it was evolutionarily designed for a completely different purpose and then adapted for that or something like that, right?
Yeah, I think you're talking about the Fox gene,
Yeah,
something like.
FOXP2, I think it
Yeah,
is.
that's the one. Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
interesting, but I'm sure it has so many co-effects with all these other genes. Yeah, it'd be really hard to, figuring this stuff out. It might take hundreds of years and big data and everything. It's going to be really difficult. But I think for getting a small boost, like a 10% boost, I think that is possible, and it could cause social disruption because I'm sure the rich people will want to do it.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but to some
That's
extent they already
that's
do it.
a factor too. Yeah,
Yeah, but to some extent they're already doing it. So the people who are in the upper classes are self-assorting. When they get a spouse, it's usually someone who's quite intelligent. You know,
oh,
the
you think so?
Yeah, so it's unusual for someone like who's wealthy to go with someone who's just good looking but kind of dumb. Whereas that used to be more common before.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, I think I just noticed, just because I'm a little bit older, I just noticed that you see less of that than what you used to see.
Oh, okay.
Because it used to be like, let's say you're a little bit wealthy as a man, especially. You would say, oh, well, this girl's like kind of dumb, but she's pretty. And that used to be good enough.
Yeah.
But now that's starting to be kind of laughed at or unacceptable. So
Oh, okay.
yeah, so it's almost like both partners in a marriage are expected to be on some sort of higher level now.
So what do you think about that?
Well, I think this assortment, it might eventually cause trouble, but I think we're going to get so blown away with technology it hardly matters. I mean, it's almost like the whole socialism versus capitalism argument, and I still see people arguing about this, and I consider it so silly because we're coming to a time period where both of them are going to break down because capitalism
How so?
requires workers and socialism
Yeah.
requires workers, and the chance that we're going to have something that's identifiable as a worker is very unlikely.
So you think like especially all the standard jobs, like shitty jobs at stores that I've had, for example, especially are gonna completely go away. But like, not only that, but like all jobs at some point in the future.
Yeah, I think that there'll be whole classes of people who can't get any kind of employment. And once it gets around 25%, you start to get problems. And I'm not saying that AI or robots can take all jobs, but I think they could probably take 25% of jobs. And if they do that already, there's a serious problem.
So what do you think about like I've heard this before, like the hashtag jobocalypse,
Hmm.
whatever you call it in that. But do you think that this is going to be similar to other social disruptions in history, like when we got cars and they eventually replaced horses, for example. There was a lot of social disruption, but then there were new markets created to adapt for those. Do you think that'll be different because it'll be AI and there won't be new markets created because of that?
Yeah, I think exactly. It'll be different, and I think humans are not well equipped to deal with it. Well, because the thing is, since the Neolithic Revolution, we've been working on something called the economic problem. And I think the type of AI that we're going to be getting soon is going to be solving the economic problem. So it means that people who are just like kind of lounging and sitting back, they'll be able to have enough machinery going on with the few people who want to work, can probably take care of the whole society. So, in a sense, the economic problem will be solved at that point. And, then it'll be very unlikely that people will want capitalism. And they won't want socialism either, because socialism's all about the worker. So we'll need a new system. And I'm not sure what this system will be, but it can't be capitalism and it can't be socialism. So that's why I find like probably 25% or maybe 30% of people are still talking about the whole socialism versus capitalism thing. And I find it irrelevant. Because it's really happening soon. Like I don't know if you heard about there was a 5,000 times increase in the ability of neural nets to process.
No,
It's just
I didn't hear about that.
yeah. So
Holy shit.
this was just recently it was announced. This is like a software upgrade in a sense. And there's another algorithm upgrade. There was another times 100 on top of that. But this one, I'm not sure how those two will fit together. But it used to be that a supercomputer. So we're talking used to be. We're talking last month. A supercomputer could model the brain of a frog. And now what it is with this times 5,000 increase, you could model the brain of a frog on your smartphone.
Holy shit.
Yeah, so that's
Wow.
that's pretty amazing. So okay, it doesn't take many more of that. In fact, if you had another 5,000 increase, then you'd be able to model a human on your phone.
Wow.
Yeah. So now then we'd have to of course figure out what does the human brain look like, but you can see just from the information part of the science, you'd be able to model it. And even if you couldn't model it perfectly, if you can model it well enough that it can say, do you want fries with that? And it can have a little hand and things like that. Well, it's taking away a lot of jobs. So I'm not arguing necessarily that AI has to be able to take away all jobs. But if it can take away 25% of jobs or enough that people get upset, then you have to move to a new economic system.
It sounds like the way you were describing it, though, that sounds like a good outcome ultimately. At least perhaps until we adapt a new system that is not capitalism or socialism, and that ends up being a bad system or
Hmm.
something like that.
Well, I'm thinking for like a future system that people might have to accept more diversity in terms of how much people want to have government intrude upon their lives. Because you can get
That makes a lot of sense. We were just talking about that earlier in terms of you're traveling now. Like there isn't one system of government that works well everywhere, all over the world, for every culture.
hmm Yeah, people have to have different, and even within a culture, like you might be someone. Okay, let's say you're someone who wants to ski out of bounds in dangerous parts of the Rocky Mountains. Well, you might have one future, one future idea would be you can't do that because it's too dangerous, and the search and rescue might be dangerous if you get into, if you get into trouble and you need rescue. So that's one line of argument. But there's another line of argument saying, you should be free to do what you want to do. And, you didn't ask that there be an expensive search and rescue. So, these two things, like if you have a future society where a lot of stuff is done by robots, we'll have to contend with these questions. Should you be allowed to risk your own life? Like, do you have to be safe all the time, or can you be unsafe?
Yeah, I mean that's an important question.
Mm-hmm. And
I'm more inclined to let people do unsafe things if you want to, but I mean, if we're living in a completely different kind of society, there are probably factors that I haven't even considered that would be important for that sort of thing.
Well, I think the drug laws come into this as well. So you might have, someone would say, you can't use GHB, let's say. And you say, well, why not? They say, well, there's some chance that you could be injured from it. And you say, well, what's the chance I could be injured from it? Let's say they say it's 1%. They just make up a number. Well, then if you go skiing out of bounds in some dangerous avalanche area of the Rocky Mountains, maybe it's also a 1% risk. So why would you be allowed to have the one risk and not the other? Like at a certain point, society's got to be mature enough to talk about this and to figure out what's allowed and what's not allowed. Yeah, and I'm almost thinking that we might have to develop into different clans of people. So, for instance, you could have 5 different clans of people, and they would have to interact differently with the law. So you could be someone who's very, very into safe spaces. And then for you, it's illegal to go skiing out of bounds, and it's illegal to take drugs, like a lot of things like that. But then for someone else, maybe they're like they want to be more autonomous. And for them, they can take whatever drugs they want. They can go skiing out of bounds. And you might have like graduations in between, but you have to decide what kind of clad or tribe you're in.
I would be in that second kind of tribe.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, I really enjoy risks as well. Yeah, when I was younger, I used to go up in the bush, and I used to live alone in the bush, actually, for sometimes long periods of time. Yeah, I've done like 86 days without speaking or seeing a human.
Holy shit, wow, what was that like?
It's really mind-bending. It's actually stronger than any other drug. If you go out and you spend time alone in the wilderness, it's the strongest form of drug. You really meld with the surroundings.
Wow.
Yeah, you become one with nature after a while. Yeah, it's impossible for anyone to sneak up on you. Like after 86 days in the bush without seeing a human or speaking. Like, even when my friend came to visit, I was mentally and physically aware of his approach. And I could even, I'm aware of the entire forest. So I knew from the sounds of the animals and the squirrels, oh yeah, he's coming. And even when I was sleeping, I was aware of this. Because, part of the effect of being in the bush is you enter a kind of dream time after a while. So your waking and sleeping are quite similar. So, when you're asleep, you're aware of the motions of the animals around you, and you can notice the tracks of them in the morning. You can see they actually did what you dreamed of. It's like you're dreaming reality. But then in the daytime, you're not forming anything out of concepts. You're simply daydreaming, but you follow your daydreams. And if you ever make a big mistake, then you have a vision. And if you follow what that vision tends to tell you, then you can solve your problem.
Oh, wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah, like for instance,
that's quite a claim too, that it's like the strongest drug, like even more stronger than like ayahuasca or something like that.
Okay, I'm not sure if it's stronger than ayahuasca, because that's pretty strong, and I haven't tried that. Because when I was in the ayahuasca area, like I was floating down the Amazon, I was with this Mexican guy, and he did a lot of drugs. He did cocaine and everything. So I thought we were going to do ayahuasca together, and he's like, "No, I don't want to do it." So I ended up not doing it as well. But I have some friends who did it, and it's quite strong. So I'm not sure if it's as strong as that,
Yeah,
but I know from other.
Psychedelic on Earth, isn't it?
Yeah, it's supposed to be pretty strong that way. I mean, DMT and stuff like that as well.
I
It's a
smoked
similar thing.
DMT once, allegedly.
Ooh, allegedly good. That's a good little addendum to what you say. Yeah, so I know a lot of the effects of some of these various drugs, allegedly. And in comparison, yeah, the bush time, if you do it a long enough time, it's really intense. Like, for instance, the one time...
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, like for instance, when you get a vision, is if you're making a mistake. So at one time, like there'd been a drought for a long time, and the pine forest I was living in very crispy and dry. And I had a vision, suddenly like just stopped me in my tracks. I had this vision of the skeletal arm sticking out from a lake where all the water had dried up. And it was all like, when the mud kind of goes into hexagons because it dries and kind of gets crispy. Well, I had a vision of that. And then I had to piece out what that would mean and act upon it. But without words, because after a while you can't form concepts or words. You have to piece it out with other sub-dreams because you're in dream time. And so I went... So I found myself walking up to check my water supply. There was a place a couple kilometers away, higher up on a mountain where there was a spring. And I noticed it had gone down to mud. My water was gone. So the vision was warning me that my water supply was gone. I needed to find a new water supply.
Oh wow.
Yeah, and
That's
sometimes,
fascinating.
yeah, and you get so good at knowing what goes on in the bush. Like you get to know all the animals. You can tell like the difference between a bear and a deer and an elk just by the sound. How thick their legs feel as they go through the bush. Like it's just amazing. You get into this major bush mode, and then when you get back to around humans, it's really sketchy because you have to. Well, you find first of all that there's so much information coming off a face that you can read people's minds from their face, and that's really sketchy.
By reading their facial expressions.
Yeah, so it's also in what they say, but also on their face as well. Like people's faces are open books. So really, when someone lies to you, in a way, you're kind of allowing them to lie to you because all that information is there.
Isn't something like 90% of our communication nonverbal or something like that too?
Yeah, I think it is because I didn't bother to learn. Like I was traveling around in areas that are almost at random. So when I go to a country like India, I'm not just around the area where they're speaking English or Hindi or Urdu. Like there's hundreds of languages, like 80 something languages, and plus some minor languages. So the language is changing all the time. But I would just go off people's faces as well. So I was using kind of some of my experience from bush time. You can always figure out what's going on unless something very complicated is being discussed.
Wow.
Yeah, but you hardly need that. What's most important for traveling is you want to know whether someone's a good person or a bad person. So the face is more important. And you can be distracted. Like let's say a bunch of people are trying to talk to you in French, and you're trying to figure out which one to hire you to get a motorcycle to go somewhere. Well, among the group of people who swarmed around you, some of them want to just stab you and take your stuff. And you've got to look. You look through the face and you decide who to go for. And you can make a mistake and then you end up dead. Like I had a buddy who was quite a well-known, like Justin Alexander. He got killed. I think it was like a year ago or a couple of years ago. And his intuition was trying to tell him. His intuition was trying to keep him alive, but he ended up being killed anyway. And
Wow.
yeah, and the situation for him was he was in the Himalayas, and he was wanting to study yoga in a cave. So he was looking for a yoga teacher, and he found this one guy. And at the time, I'd been talking to him because he wanted to do some bush time. So we'd been talking online, and I was trying to give him advice for spending like months in the bush. He was planning to do this somewhere in India, but he mentioned he was going off to study yoga in this cave, and I'm like, okay, cool. And then like some days passed, I hadn't heard from him. Then like a few weeks passed, and okay, kind of weird. And then I noticed online there was a petition of people like they were trying to gather money to send a helicopter to look for him. So I thought, oh, this is really weird. Like he should have been back by then. But I wasn't as worried as some other people because I thought, okay, he's just gone off into the bush already. I guess he thought that we talked enough, and he must have just gone off to live alone in the bush. So I wasn't as worried as like his girlfriend or other people who were trying to organize some sort of search out of California. But finally, like a couple of weeks had passed, so I actually called her up, who was the girl who was organizing the search. And in the course of the conversation with her, I realized halfway through that he was dead. Because she was telling me the additional details, like he'd left his motorcycle in a village, his passport was there in his wallet, like weeks had passed, he hadn't been back. Yeah, and then one thing that really drove it home to me, she was saying his last message on Facebook, which I'd never even checked, like it was on his page. It said, oh, it's I don't feel so good about this yoga teacher I'd hired, because he just told me that he hacked off his own testicles with a carving knife in order to show how Hindu he was. And I was thinking, holy fuck. And then he wrote, actually, if I don't come back from this cave, you know what happened to me. And I was thinking, damn, that's an example of his subconscious was trying to tell him, find another yoga teacher. Because this guy's whacked. Yeah, so, but it ended up that the yoga teacher, in fact, probably did kill him because eventually they were sort of searching for him, couldn't find him. And the police arrested the yoga teacher. And then when they came back to check on him in his cell, they found out he'd hung himself with his clothing.
Holy fuck.
Yeah, which doesn't make a lot of sense unless he was the murderer.
This reminds me of I wrote a blog a long time ago called Intuition Can Save Your Life because it was based on this book by Gavin De Becker called The Gift of Fear, and that book is all about how listening to intuition can literally save your life. Like for example, women have like had experiences where they feel uncomfortable about a guy they see in a hotel or something like that, and their intuitions are telling them, don't get into the elevator with him. Don't get into the elevator with him.
Yeah.
They ignore it, and then they get into the elevator, and then they get raped and killed or something like that.
Yeah, that's part of the problem of political correctness, where people are trying to make a code of conduct. But actually, your code of conduct should be based on your intuition. So, that's
Yeah.
what I've always relied upon in travel. And, I've had so many fellow travelers who had so many more bad occurrences go on. Whereas for me, I managed to sort of dodge around all this by making sure that I go from, friendly person to friendly person. Because there's a lot of friendly people in the world, but there's also guys who are just fixing to kill you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So,
This is
yeah,
this
yeah.
is this is actually another subject that basically brought me to mixed mental arts and got me more involved with it too. Because back when I was a militant atheist, I kind of bought this whole rationalist philosophy about how yes, praise the mighty holy rationalism. We can
Mm.
be rational and improve the world by being rational. And everyone is rational all the time. Get rid of those fucking pesky emotions and
Yeah.
intuitions. But in reality, like we operate off of our intuitions to inform our supposed rationality, and you can't be rational unless you're operating off of your intuitions anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I have a private theory that our intuitions are a little bit like that. There's a theory that was disproved. It's called Gaia, and it's the theory that the whole Earth, kind of evolves to kind of keep a status
Oh
for.
yeah, I've heard that idea before.
Yeah. No, there's a problem with Gaia, and the problem is there's not like imagine if the Earth was instead a paramecium, and all the time went bloop bloop, and you'd have like two Earths, and then bloop bloop. Now there's four. If it went like that, and some of them were destroyed and some of them not, well then you would have evolution could act upon it because it would have this multiplication, and it would be being paired back by reality, and the reality would shape it then. And so, the Gaia hypothesis fails for Earth because you only have one Earth. So there's no possibility that it can be acted upon. But in a way, the brain is kind of like an Earth because it's like a very complicated collection. It's almost like a planet in terms of its complexity. And you have an ecosystem of thoughts in there. So instead of a biosphere, you have like a conceptual sphere of all these concepts sort of evolving and trying to exist within the structure that's your brain. In a way, you could look at it like a planet, like Gaia. And since these brains do, in a sense, they reproduce, and some of them fail, some of them succeed more. There is evolution acting upon it, and I think this evolution of reality can shape the structure of the mind as a whole, almost the way an ecosystem could be shaped. But here it's like an ecosystem of relays for creating concepts or picking up concepts, and in a way that can be shaped so that you have a deep intuition of what reality is. Yeah, so I think humans naturally have that intuition.
That's a really fascinating analogy. Yeah, I read have you read the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov?
I did a long time ago, so I remember
Yeah.
some parts of it. Yeah.
One of those ones in the that I was just reminded of that because one of those newer ones in the series, I read the series like a year or two ago maybe, and I remember one of the newer books in that series. In that book, the characters go to this planet that used to be Earth, that basically is Gaia now, and like everyone has this psychological, or not psychological, like metaphysical connection, and they all have a metaphysical connection to the entire planet and all that kind of stuff.
Wow. Okay. Well, I'm not sure how that could evolve, but I do think from the point of view of the human brain, I think our intuition did evolve now.
Isaac Asimov, so anything can happen.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, he had really good books. Part of the reason I was thinking about this Gaia hypothesis is because if you add it up, probably for several years of my life, I've existed without concepts. So it's one of the mistakes I find that academics often make is they assume, there's this whole idea of rationality and these academic concepts. Well, academics really hone their ability to almost to contend with concepts. It's like they're fencing with concepts, like they're making this concept to battle that concept. But I don't think they realize that.
All the time too.
Yeah, but I don't think they realize. So here's the thing about concepts. They're all in error. And you notice this if you spend a lot of time alone in the wilderness and you're, after about 24 days, you lose a habit you don't even know that you have. This habit is the habit of putting everything into conceptual form so that you can put words to it. And there's a power to putting words to what your thoughts are, is that you can communicate it with others, and then together you can use the group to solve problems. Or in some cases, it is good to conceptualize it. If you're trying to work on something very lofty and strange, you're trying to do it piece by piece, and you're trying to break it up. So it's a way of like breaking up a problem. But if you're alone in the wilderness for a long time, this part of your brain gets shut down, and you're actually working on a deeper intuitive level. So never at any time would any word or concept or anything even similar come across your mind. It's all just dreams and intuition. And you notice when you come back to civilization and everyone's, first of all, it seems like everyone's kind of nasty to each other. It's almost like, every word they're using is like a crowbar where they're trying to get into someone's brain and get some sort of dominance. I'm not sure why this impression occurs, but for myself and for other people who've done a lot of bush time, you notice it when you come back to the city. So the people in the city who are very adept with concepts and they consider themselves quite intellectual, they're actually being very nasty to each other. Or so it seems if you're coming out of the forest. And I notice people in small villages in Nepal and stuff who hardly ever see a stranger. You can see they're on that wavelength as well, that kind of bush time wavelength. They're in the dream time.
It sounds like a much more psychologically healthy wavelength in many ways.
Yeah, in a way it is. And also, what's important for the idea of intellectual discussions is that you notice that when you begin to make concepts again, you notice every time that when you build your concept, you smash a whole bunch of it. So let's say you have this idea, let's call it, but it's not even an idea. It's like an intuition and a dream time thing. It's like an understanding that's coming to you intuitively. Now you try to put a word to it. It's almost like a poet where you have to be a master poet to make something that's at all, apt. But really, when you try and make a sentence, you're making all these concepts, and they're not very apt at all. Like, you notice what you're breaking, and it's really like it's garbage all the way along, but it's the best you can do. And even the stuff that's garbage and it's the best you can do, someone might say, wow, you're really well spoken. And you might be thinking, no, it seems like garbage. But that's what most of these concepts that form these arguments that people are using. They're actually not, the deeper holistic intuition of the whole of reality. So they're all like grossly defective.
That makes me think a lot about postmodernism, which I've also been learning a lot over the past year or so. And like, one of the main things you learn from that is that you can deconstruct any concept.
Yeah, you can. No, I think I mostly agree with Peterson's criticism of it, where he's saying they're not all equal. So of course there is infinite ways you can deconstruct, but they're not all equal. And I think that when you, like, for instance, your intuition can probably tell you what's a more reasonable interpretation than not.
Oh yeah, you and I were talking about this the other day.
Yeah, it's almost as if, let's say you wrote a chapter, and I knew you really well, and then somehow we got rocketed into the future. You were gone, like, deep into history now, but I was trying to explain to people of the far future what your idea was. If I knew you really well, I would have better insight on it than someone who's just going off your words. And this is something that postmodernists would not necessarily agree with, because they're saying, oh, well, someone's interpretation in the far future, maybe it's whatever crazy interpretation, as long as they can back it up, it's just as valid. But, there was something real that you were trying to get to some extent. I mean, it's not perfectly, but there was something you were trying to get to. And someone who knew you really well would probably have better insight into what that was than someone who just went off your words hundreds of years in the future.
See, the reason that I agree, I used to agree much more with the Jordan Peterson conception of that, but I agree more with the postmodernist one now, is that you can argue that, like, there are infinite interpretations. Although there are infinite interpretations, some are arguably better than others. I would say that that's just an argument from pragmatism. Like, some are more pragmatic than others, but it doesn't necessarily mean that one is more moral than the other.
Yeah, so I would agree with you there, and I think also postmodernism has moved on from the kind of postmodernism that Peterson is criticizing. So I think soon his big problem with postmodernism might fade away, because it looks like the philosophers who work on it, or whoever else who works on it, have noticed that there are some problems with the most basic interpretation of postmodernism. And I think they're working on more advanced interpretations that perhaps won't have these problems.
Yeah, and I mean, also, although I consider myself a fan of Jordan Peterson, although that's like blasphemy.
Yeah, I know it's blasphemy.
Mixed mental arts. I have criticized his conception of postmodernism myself, because he says that he seems to argue that not only do postmodernists think that there are infinite conceptions of concepts and there is no one that's more right, or there's no one that's more morally correct rather than any other one. He seems to argue that this also means that they want to bring down all power structures so they can give the power to themselves instead. Which,
yeah,
like, if you actually read, like, at least Foucault and Derrida, which I myself am more familiar with and are considered the seminal postmodern philosophers to a lot of people. I used to kind of assume that, but once I understood it better and actually read the original text and heard people like Thaddeus Russell explain it more, that's all just added implications that are not in the original writing. They're not talking about, like, bringing down power structures. They're just, like, deconstructing concepts.
Mm-hmm. Well, the thing is, I have an additional problem that Peterson doesn't have, though, or even that you don't have with postmodernism, and that's I dispute their right to use that name and to pretend as if they discovered something. Because really, their postmodernism is just a kind of a cruder, more conceptual, and therefore less useful version of Zen.
Oh yeah, I mean, you could argue that any philosophy, including postmodernism, is just a newer idea of lots of things. Like to a certain extent, Socrates, even using the Socratic method, was kind of like a postmodernist thing way back when he was doing that, and you could say that Nietzsche had some postmodern ideas too.
Yeah, true, and in a way, Peterson's a kind of like a subset of postmodernism as well. So, I'm just kind of against like the idea of like you have these ideas floating around, and then once some guys from France do it, everyone's like, oh, the French have done it now. Well, actually, they were kind of behind some of the other people, so I kind of dispute the name being taken from them, but I'm not like up in arms about it because I think that we're moving on from postmodernism to a more building on what they were doing there, which essentially I think the earliest people to be talking about this is probably the Zen people. But you can go back even earlier, and I think hunter-gatherers would be aware of that. Because you're intuitively Zen-like if you spend a lot of time in the bush. So it's almost like humans have two modes. People who don't do bush time only have the one mode. They only have like the camp mode. That's when you're around people and you're very conceptual. But the other mode is this bush mode, which is like Aboriginal dream time. And I've talked to some Aborigines, they have the same, when they go walkabout, they have the same effect. And it's like the flip side, like the other side of human nature. You still there?
You still there?
Yeah. For some reason, you disappeared for a second, but now you're back.
Okay, yeah, you cut out for me for a second there.
Oh, strange. Okay, I don't know on which end that was because nothing happened here, but.
I just turned off my camera and muted myself when that happened because sometimes that fixes problems.
Oh, okay, yeah. So perhaps you've dealt with it. Yeah. So the Aborigines in their dream time. This is the other way of being human, and I think modern people don't see that as much. And I think that the Zen practitioners were one of the first quite civilized people to get back into that. So it's almost like an earlier hunter-gatherer understanding of things, because there are things beyond concepts, and you can see the deficiencies of concepts, like absolutely, like as plain as your face when you go and do this. So postmodernism is actually extremely ancient, but at the same time, I think the postmodernists miss the intuitive part of it. So your intuition is what's supposed to tell you what's there is infinite interpretations of things that go on, and your intuition and your dreams tell you what's correct.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'm basically familiar in general with how Zen Buddhism works, but I'm only mildly familiar with it, and that's one of many things that I want to study a lot more. And also, even though I generally don't like labels, so I wouldn't call myself a postmodernist, but I consider myself a fan of it. I also agree with criticisms like my friend Hayden Bruce, who's also the pragmatic Christian.
Mm-hmm.
I also agree with his criticisms of like how, from the perspective of pragmatism, yeah, it's all well and good to deconstruct concepts and stuff like that, but it doesn't tell you like how to live your life. It's not a very pragmatic philosophy.
Well, it seems like you would be
add like pragmatism or something like that to it.
Well, it seems like you'd be a fan of Peterson quite a lot then, because he's trying to use this sort of postmodern idea, but he's trying to say that we should favor this particular one that's been time-tested over a couple thousand years or more to be able to tell you how you should properly orientate yourself in life.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I do consider myself a fan of Peterson too. I mean, I have things that I disagree with him about, but I like his project that he's doing with that. Basically, like he's all about pragmatism and using like religious metaphors to help people and stuff like that. And I mean, some people, including people I respect, have talked about how like to them it just seems like an old-fashioned conservative form of Christianity or something like that. But
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I mean, even if that's the case, it seems like it's working better than other things that have happened before. And I mean, it seems like he has good intentions. So I like what he's doing.
Yeah, I do too, and I don't even have trouble with him. Like he's more conservative than I would be. I'm somewhat more toward the center, and in some ways I'm progressive in some areas quite a lot more than what he is. But I don't mind him because I find that he's intellectually honest. So when he talks about the left, you can see that he's criticizing what the left is doing now. but he's also admitting that he's presenting the conservative point of view. But he's also saying that someone else can say that the hierarchy is corrupt and we need to reform it. So that would be the left point of view. And he's not actually saying how, like he's not really delving deep into that. But then again, he's not left. So he's saying that's for someone else to do. But he's leaving that room. It's not like he's saying I'm right on everything. He's saying I'm partly right. And so he's right in terms of putting the conservative argument. And there is a conservative argument. But he's saying and other people can put the leftist argument. And that'd be fine.
Even though people say that he seems like angry and stuff like that sometimes, like to me he seems really calm and reasonable most of the time. And one thing I appreciate about him too is similar to his intellectual honesty, like you were talking about, is that he seems really open-minded to having his mind changed and to actually listening to different perspectives. Like I was watching one of the recent videos where he was on Dave Rubin's podcast, and he was suggesting at the end of it that maybe we should have some sort of debate, and one or more of us should defend the hardcore leftist position to see if we can understand it better. Like he suggested that, even though he rallies against this kind of political philosophy all the time.
Yeah, so it's quite honest of him to say that there is a point where the left can come in and the left should be listened to and they're equally as important. I mean, he always says the left is just as important as the right, even though he's on the right. So yeah, I respect him for that. And I wonder why he's so, I guess some people are tired of too much talk of him, and I am, to some degree too. But if he wasn't a famous person so that no one was really jealous, I think he'd be a very good member of mixed mental arts. Like if he was just a dude who was on here and he had these ideas, people say, oh yeah, that's cool. But because, it's almost like a thing with intellectuals or people who, like to talk about intellectual things. If someone becomes really popular, they're like, oh, he's too popular. It's almost like if a band becomes like U2 or something, everyone's listening to them. But if you were the only one who knew about U2 back in the day, you'd think, oh, they were cool. But then they become really popular, like, oh, they're lame. So.
And you also can be like, I don't like this guy who everyone else likes. That makes me cool, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so I consider him like one of, if someone would say, yeah, you can pick only like 100 intellectuals to listen to, I'd probably make him one of the 100. I think he has enough good ideas for that. But, there's a lot of other voices too, so.
Even going with like my weakest support of him that I try to give sometimes, depending on who I'm talking to, what I say in favor of him is that, I like to expose myself to a wide variety of different perspectives, and I think his perspective is a valuable one, regardless of how much I agree or disagree with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fair enough. And I've noticed though that people have never made I have a criticism of his views. He doesn't make nearly as good a Christian as what he pretends that he makes. And here's the argument. So imagine you had different dials where you could change physical aspects of things. But you laid on top of that the structure that he says is the Christian structure. So he has a Christian meta-mythological structure. Now imagine you change these dials so that instead of Adam and Eve, you have like creatures that are kind of like out of Alien or out of like H.P. Lovecraft's Call of Cthulhu. So you could have like Azathoth, the crazy, destroyer at the center of the galaxy, and the weird fungal creatures that try to infect people and devour them and all that. You could actually put these entities in as some sort of, organism or some kind of society. And you could make them have the same mythical metastructure as the Christians. To some extent, the movie series Aliens does this. I mean, they have these aliens forming like what seems like a mythic Christian metastructure, but at the same time, they burst out of people's chests and they're really aggro and they're extremely violent and acidic and everything else, right? They're horrible. They're like demons. So you could make a society of demons in hell, pretty much, and you could still lay the Christian mythic metastructure on top of them. And you could meet one of these beings, and just before he kills you, he could say, yeah, I'm a Christian, right? And in the Jordan Peterson sense, he would be.
Yep.
Yeah, because how, like, for instance, we sacrifice sheep. Well, imagine you met an alien that's like some tentacled, octopus-headed alien, and it devours your organs and your brain and everything like that. Well, okay, this would be a horrible creature. But from his point of view, the human would be no more intelligent than what a sheep is to us. So he's like, oh yeah, I'm just sacrificing the animal. It's my sacrifice toward God to become a better person and all that, right? So he could have a Christian metastructure that, from his point of view as an ultra-intelligent alien that's super violent, he'd be saying, well, I'm doing just like what the ancient Israelites are doing.
Yeah, that's an important point too. Yeah, I mean, like one of the reasons that I'm still an atheist is that although I've gained much more respect for religion in recent years, and like I've said before, if I had to choose a way, if I was forced to be Christian, the Jordan Peterson way is probably the way I would choose. But and I've also gained respect for studying other religions and mythologies too. And to me, like, I understand, like, I have no problem whatsoever with people choosing to be Christian if they want to, but I don't see why anyone would choose any religion, including Christianity or any other religion, more than any other. I mean, like, it just comes down to a personal choice for people. Like, it's not as if Christianity is the ultimate best religion for everyone or anything like that.
But I think that sort of Peterson's very complicated meta view of religion might eventually prevail. So even though I identified some weaknesses with it. And in fact, this is part of his argument with Sam Harris. Like, Sam Harris is a very cosmically orientated person, whereas, Peterson's more orientated toward Earth, in Earth as embedded in the cosmos of deep time. But for Sam Harris, he's kind of like a religious person in a way. He's kind of like that whole Buddhist sort of religious that's entirely cosmic. So what he wants is a kind of morality that could, like, even if you meet, let's say, an alien creature that's in some way horrible, but somehow still Christian, so it's got the Christian metastructure, he would want to be able to say, you're wrong with what you do. And I think that's why he was dabbling in, so he was dabbling in vegetarianism and stuff like that. So he wants a cosmic morality, where when the alien creature who claims to be Christian comes and starts eating your brain and sucking out your heart, he wants to be able to say, the universe says you're wrong. So in a way, he's more cosmic.
I like his talk about spirituality from an atheist perspective, though. Like, I like his book, Waking Up, A Guide to Spirituality Without Religion, because I think that, well, like, he basically gets most of the way to the point that I've come to recently, which is that everyone's like spiritual or tribal or religious or whatever word you want to use about something. And like, I personally meditate too, like, from a completely secular context. But it is true too. Like, one of the criticisms that I share with Sam Harris now is that he thinks it's really important to have a moral framework for everyone, and that there should be an objectively correct moral framework.
Yeah, I mean, someone who was talking to, sometimes I listen to his podcast, and someone he was talking to had a good criticism where he's saying, Sam, you're building this contraption. It's like some sort of flapping, ornithop, flapping airplane way up in the sky with so many gears that only Sam Harris can fly it, right? He's saying you have to have this ethical framework, but the ethical framework he's making is so complicated that it's not useful to any human who's not super intellectual and, like, really, really committed to it. So, yes, because you need something quick and dirty for, like...
I understand, because I have constructed this with all of these details.
Therefore,
I am rational and moral.
Yeah, and then on the fly, you notice that, someone spills coffee on him and he gets really pissed off. So you can see, like, on the fly, there's no time to bring this whole moral contraption into play. So it's kind of funny.
Also, let's not forget that while someone was spilling coffee on him, they misrepresented his opinions.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but I like him as well. The thing about me, and probably about you too, is I like these different intellectuals. And even if I think some of their views are not correct or silly, I keep in mind that some of my views are not correct and also they're silly. So, I guess I'm more tolerant toward that. I just see sort of the fun of it.
Yeah, see, like, I try to be that way too. Like I was saying earlier, I like to try to expose myself to as many different perspectives as possible. And I mean, like, I'm subscribed to both of their YouTube channels too, and I still follow both of their YouTube channels / podcasts.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, it's pretty fun. Yeah, I'm interested to see, they're having this argument now about the nature of truth. I'm interested to see where that goes as well. So, now...
Yeah, someone said the other day that audio of that new debate came out, I think, something like that, right?
Yeah, I think it is out, so I'm probably going to try to find it and listen to it. Yeah, because I'm interested if Sam makes some of the same criticisms of Jordan that I was thinking of, or maybe he has different points of view.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I'm interested to hear that too. And actually, I think I was telling you the other day too. I'm also excited when Sam's bulldog Ed Kennedy, that guy who is really he's a really big supporter of Sam Harris. And I've talked with on my podcast before, and then also Hayden Bruce, the pragmatic Christian who I mentioned earlier, where they're going to come back on my podcast. I talked to both of them on here before, but they're going to come back and we're going to start by talking specifically about truth which should be interesting because one of them obviously supports Sam Harris more, and one of them supports Jordan Peterson more. And I think my perspective is probably somewhere in the middle of those two people, but they also obviously will have slightly different opinions from Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson too.
Yeah. My opinion of truth is also somewhere in the middle between them. So I'm quite interested to see if they converge in the end toward like a unified definition. Be interesting to see if the minds can come together, because they were originally at each other's throats about it. So it'd be quite fun to see.
Yeah, like that original podcast that we were talking about. It was basically just 2 hours of them arguing about truth. Because like we were talking about before, like. Jordan, I kind of agree with Jordan Peterson's perspective in the sense that there are some metaphorical truths that can be scientifically false, but can be more pragmatically useful for people than scientific truths. And Sam Harris really doesn't like that idea.
Yeah, he doesn't like it. But here's the funny thing about Sam Harris: so he comes out against fundamentalists so much. But from my point of view, it's almost like the whole socialism versus capitalism idea. I think that this is no longer useful. Because I think the way the technology is coming, the way it's advancing, soon it'll be offering all these things that are the things that you would believe if you were literally a Christian. Like soon technology will be able to extend life and cure disease and all these things that would be considered miracles of Jesus. And I think when that happens, people who are very literal minded will abandon religion in droves. So essentially, from my point of view, the fundamentalist Christian and the militant atheist are the same thing. Because they'll eventually converge, even though they're different now. Like in the near future, once science advances enough, someone who's a fundamentalist is a very practical person, and they're very they take things at the right at the face value of it. And when science is offering what would have been the miracles of Jesus, they'll just drift away from the church. So I think the only people left in church will probably be the ones who have some version of like a more sophisticated, like for instance, a Peterson view of religion, or perhaps like I have a more sophisticated view of the Muslim faith, for instance. I consider them a form of Zen.
That's interesting.
Yeah, like I look at the Holy Koran as one of the longest Zen koans I'd ever seen.
Oh, Islam is another religion that I've been meaning to start studying more. I have a copy of the Quran, but I haven't read it yet. But I was reading this book the other day, so I just barely started scratching the surface of Islam. And it's interesting, like I remember this one part in particular was talking about how the Muslim philosophies are divided into Sunni and Shia ones now, and I think they're apparently, at least at the time that this book was written, I'm not actually sure when this book was written, but it was talking about how there are 4 kind of different main Muslim sects within Sunni Islam and 4 different ones within Shia Islam, but those are the only ones that survived, and historically there were a lot more. So unsurprisingly, it's a lot more complicated than just that Islam is all just this one thing, and it's like morally corrupt and all that kind of shit.
Yeah, because you have this Wahhabi faith, which is like a very fundamentalist type of Islam. But yeah, there are tons of other ones, and there's even people who mix Islam with other, like for instance on the island of Lombok, they're kind of half Muslim but half some sort of local thing, almost a way like on the island of Lombok, they have a religion that's near. It's actually near to Bali. So I bring it up because we were discussing Bali earlier. So even right next to Bali, you have people who are sort of half Muslim in a strange way. They have a very unusual religion. I never got into the details of what it is, but I think it's some sort of local animistic or tribal faith mixed with Muslim. And you have a lot of these things around, like these little small sects like that are, they're deviating from what would be the norm that the Saudis especially would consider to be the norm. And even the Saudi norm for what Islam is supposed to be, that's very recent. So it's it's all up in flux. I actually don't share. I share a little bit of Sam's worry about Islam because they are kind of primitive. So if you look at the Arabs in general or Muslims in general, they're a little bit held back by some of the more fundamentalist interpretations of their religion. So they do have some work to do. But he seems to be, to my view, excessively worried about it. And I think it might be because where he's coming from as a person. Not to get too postmodern, but he is someone from the New York area, and he saw those Twin Towers were exploding, and he's someone who was from a Jewish background. So for him, it's probably much more emotional. So he considers it a bigger worry.
That's how he started his career, by writing The End of Faith the day after 9/11.
Oh, there you go. So so he's very obsessed with that, and I can kind of keep that in mind to say, okay, fair enough. But it won't affect my opinion that it's not as big as a problem as what he thinks it is. I think it'll be solved.
That's an important point, yeah. And I mean, like, terrorist attacks are obviously terrible, and I wouldn't wish them on anyone. Like, they, like, contrary to the image that is painted by the media, they don't actually happen that often, and not that many people get killed in them, which means nothing to someone who has actually experienced this, or the family member of someone who's experienced this, or something like that. But in terms of the world's violence, it doesn't represent that big of a problem, which certainly doesn't mean that it's not a problem, as you said, but it's just like the media tends to sensationalize because that's what they're financially motivated to do.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that that's the way they gain their funding. So it's almost like the way when people try to help out with famines, they end up causing them. Well, in the same sense, the way the media funds itself distorts the news so much that they're probably more of a problem than a help in a lot of these areas, and especially talking about terrorism.
Yeah, I mean, like, I was convinced by that narrative for a long time too. So.
Yeah, I mean, there is some worry about terrorism, but I would put it like number 20 maybe for the world. It's not that big a deal. I mean, I know also Sam gets all talking about it, people are going to nuke each other. I don't think they will. So I don't think the terrorists will get atomic bombs, and I don't think they'll be nuking anyone. So, I'm not as worried as what he is. But at the same time, part of the reason that I'm not worried is because there are people like Sam who are getting over worried. And this kind of balances out the people who are under worried. So maybe in general it all moves forward and it's fine.
That's a good point. That sounds like a very Zen way of looking at it.
Yeah. Well, so yeah. Looking at the big picture, you need some Sams and you need some people who are apologists. Yeah, it's all good. And anyway, humans have had a good run, so I don't obsessively worry about whether we'll exist in the future too much. We've had a pretty good run. We've been around for, we've even had civilization for 10,000 years in some places. And civilization is not that great anyway. We had tribes before that. That's fine too.
Yeah, actually, that's an even broader perspective than what I was going to talk about. I was going to talk about how, America, for example, has existed since 1776, and Canada is somewhere around 100 years younger than that, I think. Empires traditionally, I mean, like, I'm not a historian, but an empire lasting for like 300 years or so, it seems like a long time historically speaking. And there doesn't mean, like, it doesn't, if America, if it becomes the case that America is not the number one country in terms of economic development and all those other factors, it's not going to necessarily be the end of the world as some people think it's going to be.
Mm-hmm. But America still has a lot of these Cold War governmental structures or beliefs within the population. So when you guys were fighting the Cold War, you had this idea that you had to be open, like you had to be the dominant country, the leader of the West. You had to be open to people who are coming to experience the American way of life. So much more open borders than in a lot of other places. But these are unusual characteristics of America, and I think it's correcting now, and America is going to become more of a normal country. So, most countries don't accept, mass immigration of people who are undocumented. And, most countries don't accept any immigration. They would just evict whoever would come in. And I think it's likely that America will move in that direction. Because the whole idea of open borders, I think this came along with the fight against communism, and you had this idea of you have to be taking refugees from communism at first, like Vietnamese refugees or Cambodian or from wherever it was that communism was prevailing. And it's sort of built within the Americans this idea that you're somehow a special nation with a special ideology, and you should be bringing more people in to join and to make the great American project. And that's kind of like a Cold War sort of ideology, and I imagine it's fading now. Because you can see with America now, they're sort of like closing up their borders, and they're becoming more like what other countries are.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, like, it's kind of ridiculous for any country really to assume like, we're the best, everyone should come here, man.
Mm-hmm.
Why doesn't everyone just come here? And now that this sort of thing, it seems to happen in cycles like that, like historically speaking too, like that happens, and then the problem corrects itself, and then it overcorrects itself, and then it leads to completely different direction like that, basically.
Yeah, but I think that no matter what happens, the end result will probably be a tightening of borders. Because if you look at, the sort of Cold War or even prior to that sort of an imperial view, as that begins to fade, America will become more normal. But there'll be another like economic pressure that way. Because right now there's a little bit of economic pressure saying let in more people. Because these undocumented migrants, they do contribute to the economy a bit. But then as the machines get more capable, eventually the workers that you would have picking lettuce, they'll be economically useless because a robot will do that. And I think this is happening fast enough where pretty soon the economic part of the argument will drop away, and you'll have a lot of people who will be more concerned with what entitlements they get from the government. And if they have to pay out more because millions of people are coming across the border, they'll probably resist it. So I think that from a practical point of view, it doesn't matter if Trump prevails or someone else prevails. In the near term, like probably over the next 20 years, I think that the illegal immigration will probably be stemmed.
That's a really interesting perspective. I haven't thought about it from that perspective before. I should think about that some more. I wonder, I mean, you could very easily be right about that happening in the future.
Well, if the kind of AI future is the one coming about where you'd have robots and AI that's relatively cheap or cheap enough to use and to supplant humans for a lot of jobs, it changes the entire geopolitics. So how you'll compare for who's a powerful country at that point is how large a country you are and how small a human burden you have. So right now humans are a resource, and a lot of countries compete to try to get extra resources, and especially the ones who are well trained because they're a valuable resource. But if machines are taking over from a lot of what humans can do, then humans become a burden and not a resource, and that changes the whole metric. So at that point, I think, it could be that Canada would be the most powerful country in the world. So I wrote an essay once for like a military intelligence magazine of Canada versus China for who would be the most powerful. And, I was arguing in favor of Canada because Canada has very few people. Yeah, so very few people to be taken off.
Rather than China?
Yeah, much better than China because China has a huge human burden. So imagine that most things are done by machines, and you can have like a $20 billion...
I'm still here.
Okay, yeah, so you can have a $20 billion factory with like only 100 workers in it. Well, if it comes to that point, there'll be very few people that will need to have a job. And the rest of the people will have to be looked after from the surplus. So they're actually just a burden to be looked after. And even in a war, there are people you have to protect, so they're a burden also from a military point of view. And, if all the people fighting are not even people, they're just drones, and maybe you have a few humans in charge of like the drone wranglers, and you have like 50 or 100 drones controlled by each soldier. Well, then you need very few people who have to be very specialized to be the soldiers as well. So the last thing you'd want is a large population. You want as small a population as possible, and you'd want to have access to a lot of resources. So what you want to be is something like Canada, because they have a lot of resources per person.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I guess if that does happen with technology, which seems really likely, I could see how that would be feasible.
Yeah, so it's like a new geopolitical factor, and I think some people in intelligence circles are just starting to talk about it a little bit, but I haven't heard a lot of talk about it later because it really is, if AI does become cheap, and if you have like these 5,000 time improvements or 100 time improvements or even times 2 improvements that seem to come along every few months, it won't be long before you'll have robotics that can control like a hand or an actuator that are good enough that they can take sufficient jobs that you'd only want the most educated and the most capable people working and the rest not. Well, that changes the whole geopolitics of the entire world. And last thing you'd want is mass immigration of relatively untrained people. And you might not even want immigration at all because really you'd want to have like a clean environment with a lot of nature available for your people and a good quality of life and as small a population as possible.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so I'm looking to see if this change happens over the next 10 or 20 years. Should be a good thing. But I wrote an essay about it had many things in the essay, but it is something. What was I calling it now? I think I was calling it Jinn story, as in genie. But it was at the later part of that essay, I described my ideas about how Islam is a form of Zen, and that the Quran, the Holy Quran, is like a Zen koan that has to be taken all at once and not really analyzed. And I think a lot of people who are Muslims, they're making a mistake to become too conceptual with it. Because if you look at the Holy Quran from a Zen point of view, it makes much more sense than if you try to analyze it the way some of them are doing. And especially with this idea that later passages seem to cancel ones that came earlier. So this is an idea not found in the Quran. So I go into a little bit of the details of it because I actually spend more time around Muslim people than I do around Christians. And that's another thing I was kind of happy when Jordan did some talks about the Bible. I know it's kind of just his take on the Bible, but I was interested to listen to them because I don't know nearly as much about the Bible as I do about the Holy Quran.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, because most people are Muslim, or at least when you're traveling around, most areas you're going through are Muslim people. So I'd have far more conversations with them than with Christians.
Oh, okay. I didn't even know about that idea that the newer passages cancel out the older passages in the Quran either.
Yeah, so it's a mistake in the reading of it, because if you look at the Quran, you're supposed to take every passage for what it is. But some people found that they were in contradiction, and they were tempted by the fact that you can seem to cancel out a lot of the contradiction if you allow some passages to countermand others. So it's some of there's a channel of Muslim thinking which has become dominant at the moment because the Saudis went for it, but it's in a way they're canceling the meaning of earlier passages, and I think it's a big mistake. It's because they're trying to make it intellectually consistent. They're trying to be rationalist. And
Right.
the Holy Quran is not a rational document. It's a religious document. So I think that, unfortunately, some people who are very intellectual got involved in their academics. And as a result, they've misinterpreted the Quran. But if they took it as a religious document, and especially if they accept the spiritual sort of Zen reading of it, everything makes a lot more sense.
It seems like in general, when you intellectualize religions, that leads to problems.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of problems. I'm quite suspicious of the ones who think that rationality should be put above everything. I mean, I'm glad they're there because I like to hear the rational argument, but the rational argument is not everything. And sometimes the more emotional, intuitive argument, or even the Zen argument, is the one that leads to the proper interpretation, or at least a more useful interpretation.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah,
so maybe
exactly.
that's something we could get. If we talk again, maybe we could get more into that. I mean, I'm not fresh enough on that stuff in my mind, and you probably haven't read enough on it to have a conversation at the moment about it. But that'd be an interesting one for talk in the future.
Send me some links or book recommendations about that.
Okay, I will do. And actually, I wouldn't mind to wrap it up now because I'm going to have to get some breakfast because I've been talking for a few hours, and also finally the sun came out and I'm supposed to be going down to the beach. So people have been messaging me saying beach time, beach time. So so I'm going to need to get down there and get some sun.
For sure.
Yeah, there's a really good beach on the shores of the Dnieper River. So it's like a white sand beach, and things are pretty cheap because this is Ukraine. So that's part of the reason I come to hang out here for at least a few months a year.
Yeah, I appreciate all the pictures that you send me of like beautiful scenery of your travels and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I figured out a mystery. So I was down on Turkanov Island walking around yesterday, and I figured out a mystery. So there's like a pack of kind of vicious wild dogs that defend this area that looks almost like a zombie apocalypse movie set. And there's like an unfinished bridge and unfinished highway that is just kind of, it's not fallen into ruin, but it's completely abandoned because when the revolution came, the money dried up. And also there was corruption involved, so it got tied up in the court. So there's this infrastructure that's just kind of there in the forest with no one looking after it. And a pack of vicious wild dogs has taken over. And I was always wondering, like, what do they eat? Because, the dogs are pretty big, and I thought, well, I never saw any sign of deer around. I mean, I saw like things like snakes and lizards and stuff, but that's, dogs can't live on that. But then last time when I was walking through there, first of all, I found some wild apricot trees, so I was eating those. And then I came through and I saw the whole pack of wild dogs was there. And there was one standing at a distance and trying to get close, but they were growling at it and they wouldn't let it near. And I could see there was a big pile of like what looked like waste from a butcher shop, like bones with meat on it, and a huge pile of it. And the whole pack of dogs were chewing on this stuff. And I thought, oh, someone must come in with like waste from a butcher shop and dump it there. So they're feeding this pack of dogs. Now, in a way, I can see that being a problem later. Because, these dogs will be reproducing, you'll get more and more dogs, and you're going to continue to feed them, and eventually you'll have like a vicious pack of 30 dogs out in the wilderness where people are trying to walk. Yeah, but in the short term, though, it's kind of cool to solve this little mystery of, who's feeding the dogs.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I kind of watch them over the years, because I come back every summer for at least a couple of months, so I see what goes on. Like there's this one female dog, she's got 4 puppies this year, and I saw last year she had 3. So I kind of check up and see how it's going.
Oh, that's interesting. Cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All
But
right. Well, we can wrap this up here, and thanks so much for talking to me, man. This was a fucking awesome conversation.
yeah, it's been fun.
I hope we can do it again, man.
Okay, I'll send you some links after the beach, and then we can plan something for the future.
Let me just say the things I like to say at all the end of my videos, and then you can offer any plugs you have if you want to there.
Okay.
Yeah. So thanks everyone so much for watching and listening to another episode of the Mindgasms podcast. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Mike Bown as much as I did, and hope we can talk again. And also, like I always say, thank you so much for everyone who's subscribed to my YouTube channel and for everyone who's contributed to me on Patreon. And thank you so fucking much to anyone else who subscribes or contributes to me on Patreon. I appreciate the fuck out of that. You have no idea how much it means to me. And also, I love you all, and keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember, the funk cures all.
Yeah, that's an excellent wrap up. Yeah, if anyone wants to look at my book, it's called The World's Most Traveled Man, and it's available on Amazon and in a lot of, even in the States, Canada. I think there's a German edition came out under a different title. So yes, I'm still doing a little bit of promotion for that. We didn't get around to talking about travel too much, but we did a little bit.
Yeah.
And anyway, that was great. So.
I'll add the link for that on the Amazon page to the description of this video.
Okay, cool. All right.
So it's called The World's Most Traveled Man?
Yeah, that's what they called it. Yeah, now whether I'm the world's most traveled man or not, it depends on if you... Because, for instance, someone who went to the moon might be the world's most traveled man. Or there's guys who do, like, a lot of sailing. There's some who do, like, a lot of biking, like push bike or motorbiking. But what I've done is the most backpacking. So it's like 28 years nonstop back.
The world's most backpacked man
doesn't
sound as marketable.
Yeah, so I didn't even choose the title. So it's like some people, there's a few people who've criticized me for it because they've said, well, this guy's done so much sailing, or what about an astronaut who went to the moon? And I'm like, well, don't make too big a deal of the title. They just wanted to make something. I was surprised by anyone to see what they called it. But some journalists have called me that because some people think that backpacking is the most travel-y of the travel stuff. And I've done a hell of a lot of back. So I live out of a backpack, and I've just done like 28 years nonstop. So it's quite a lot of backpacking. But anyhow, I got to get down to the beach. And, it's been great. Yeah, I'll talk to you next time.
Yeah, have fun, man. Great. Thanks so much for talking. And adios, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.
All right, we are off air. All right, thanks so much for talking with me, man. That was awesome. I'm so glad we finally got to do that.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. And I better get some breakfast and get down there. So I'll tell you how the beach went. Maybe I'll send you a few pictures from there.
Sure thing, man. And yeah, send me